Hi, everyone, and welcome to this month's edition of the Benchmark for Agriculture, released to coincide with the release of the monthly prices report. My name is Peter Story. I'm the head of prices for food and agricultural commodities. I'm joined by Aled Thomas, who's an economist with the food retail and manufacturing team. How are you doing today, Aled?
I'm doing great, thank you, Peter. Life's always better when the sun is shining.
Well, exactly. It seems like, late spring has come early in the UK this year, which is a pleasure to witness. Okay, so to get straight into things, it seems like it's definitely been a bit of a wild ride since Liberation Day in early April, when a baseline 10% US import tariff was announced, and reciprocal tariffs ranging from up to 50% for around 60 countries was also brought about. After significant pushback politically, and also in the financial markets, all those tariffs, aside from the 10% baseline, were delayed until July in the hope that successful trade negotiations can happen in the meantime. Obviously, the notable exception to this has been China. And after a few rounds of reciprocal tariffs, Chinese goods now enter the US with 145% import tariff, and US goods entering US goods entering China come with 125% tariff. In the last couple of weeks, things have started to, relatively settle down. So with all this in mind, Aled, what have been the reactions in the US? What have the consequences been so far?
Well, I think when people were talking about tariff, there was a lot of concern about how that would affect the consumer in the US domestically. A tariff is a tax at the end of the day, essentially, and that would be passed on to the consumer. But that concern of driving up food inflation domestically in the US doesn't seem to have quite filtered through or hit home yet. Looking at the most recent food inflation statistics for the US, they actually, the annual inflation rate fell 0.2 percentage points month over month into March, but we did see a month over month increase. So it is likely that we might see coming April, May, when these tariffs and these changes really filter through onto products coming into the US, we might see a bit more concern about domestic pricing. But I think currently it's fair to say I think it hasn't had that real domestic effect on the consumer in the US that perhaps was initially thought when these tariffs were being bandied about.
Yeah, I guess it is still relatively early days for the tariffs, and especially, if these further tariffs go into effect in July, especially for countries like, Mexico, where there's such a large volume of produce comes into the US. Maybe then we might see a bit more of an uptick, but pretty sedate for now. So just sticking with the US though, I mean, have you noticed that many companies have started to well, look for alternatives for any countries where sourcing might become a bit of an issue going forward?
I think, at one of the most recent conferences I went to, there was a lot of talk around sustainability, and that wasn't necessarily, environmental sustainability. It was really about sustainability in the supply chain, and this was one of the biggest topics at that conference, where people were talking, how do they look at new markets? But of course, with a lot of these things, particularly here in Europe, our weather perhaps isn't as favourable to grow a lot of crops that we do see across in the US and indeed Asia. So I think people, companies are definitely looking at this. They're definitely branching out, and we will see a significant shift. I think we might come on to trade somewhat a little bit later in this video, but people are certainly now looking at different avenues to get products in and out of the US, and of course. Around the US essentially, and perhaps just cutting off the US as a market entirely if it's not going to make it pay for them.
Yes, and indeed, I was going to ask about, the consequences internationally. I mean, are we seeing much from, countries like China or countries indeed where it seems like there could be quite a large impact in the future, like the European Union, for example?
Well, I think the European Union is quite an interesting one, and specifically cheese, because people in the US absolutely love European cheese, continental cheese, of course.
And butter.
And it's often one that's sort of not thought about. So the US market accounts for around 10% of exports from the EU, but US imports are 70% of those are European supplies. So a tariff, of course, on the EU would have a perhaps disproportionate effect on cheese markets. I know it's perhaps a little more niche, but we are having sort of hearing these discussions, and of course, when there's the point of implementing the tariff originally, I think Donald Trump would say it was to get revenue. But I think one could probably argue the real point of implementing the tariffs were to get these people round the negotiating table to talk about trade deals and such. And I think to a certain extent, depending on how you measure it, he has been relatively successful in that. Of course, we've seen some sort of leeway, particularly with the EU and the UK, and I know he has perhaps reneged a little bit on some of those harsh tariffs he put forward on Liberation Day. But the knock-on effect, of course, of if high tariffs were put on EU imports, for example, cheese into the US, that will drive prices down then internationally because, of course, there's more cheese in the market and it's got to be
Yeah.
sold somewhere else, so it's got to be sold domestically. So what he is doing in the US will, of course, have effects in places across the pond, like here in the EU.
Yeah, of course. I mean, you know, cheese, to use your example, is almost certainly a microcosm of many, 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 many other agricultural markets. And, I guess we will just need to see, come July, what the lay of the land is, to see how really all these different agricultural markets are going to be affected by this.
I was going to say, if I had to categorize the international market currently, it would just be, in one word, would be uncertain. That's what
Mm.
everyone is saying. It's
Yeah.
uncertain. They're not, prices aren't necessarily fluctuating internationally because of the tariffs, because people are just not sure what's going to happen. There are those that are perhaps buying to try and mitigate in case something happens, and there are those that are waiting to buy or sell in case a tariff is imposed at a later date. So uncertainty is still flowing, and I'm sure this will be something that we talk about for many weeks and months to come.
Yes, definitely the first victim of the tariffs is certainty. So turning to weather now, it's been a relatively quiet period, and certainly in the past few weeks. It doesn't seem like there's been many major weather events in key agricultural regions to speak of. I mean, part of this is possibly the shift from the La Nina weather conditions, which came about in at the start of 2025 to more neutral temperature conditions in the Pacific Ocean earlier this year. But however, are you expecting either an El Nino or a La Nina weather event to surface later in the year?
Yeah, I think you make a good point. It's fair to say that the past few years, with all the other things that have been going on, the weather has been quite volatile as well and caused significant kind of production and problems and transport problems in all parts of the world. But 2025 does seem to have started off somewhat on a perhaps calmer note, for a better word. I think there is expectations that we have a broadly neutral 2025 in terms of weather events, but we might see a La Nina event towards the end of the year. But again, it's that's what's expected so far. But I think generally people are thinking that it's going to be a broadly neutral year in terms of weather events, and that'll be positive for production in some senses.
Yeah, yeah, I'll certainly keep extremes either one way or the other, both in terms of, like flooding or heat waves and droughts, a bit more mitigated. So that certainly good news for producers on the whole. And so, despite the lack of headline news, what are a few crops and geographies which are having either good or bad seasons so far this year due to the weather?
Well, I think one of the probably the best seasons that I've had, and they've just finished wrapping up their harvest in the past recent weeks, is olive oil. Of course, it has had a tremendously poor few years, but this year, now in the latest crop that's just come in, has been somewhat benefited by that calmer weather. We've seen production in Spain, which is the world's largest olive oil producer, up 7%. And Turkey, for example, is up 109%, Tunisia 55%, Greece 50%. So some of these, kind of key producing regions are really seeing the benefit of perhaps a bit calmer weather.
Mm.
Perhaps a different side, a different continent over in Brazil. There's expectations that we might have record sugarcane harvests this year, which of course will, if what comes to light and the weather stays as it is, and harvesting is about to happen this month in certain regions, and then August in the northeast of the country, if it's all stays as it is and we have these record levels of sugarcane harvest, that will of course perhaps ease pressures on pricing in other places. But I think it's fair to say as well that in sort of the standard, perhaps more basic agricultural commodities like wheat are just benefiting from that less volatile weather. Of course, a dry spell can be good, but it has to be a dry spell at the right time, for example. But we are seeing, a key wheat producer, France, for example, has seen sort of relatively stable crop condition reports, but it is expected that they're going to have a generally good harvest overall because the sort of uncertainty of weather is very low at the minute, and crops will just be able to progress more naturally, perhaps than being forced by weather events.
Fantastic. I mean, I certainly noticed going to the shops recently that I didn't need to remortgage my house to buy a bottle of olive oil, so that was certainly good to see. So really, there are no major concerns for any major crops at the moment, or is it mostly just good news?
No, I would say there's no major concerns for crops at the moment. It seems to be particularly people, generally optimistic about production in 2025. And another thing, slightly off piece perhaps, but we've obviously talked a lot on this benchmark videos before about animal diseases. And of course, coming into a year perhaps where we have less of these sort of high weather events will mean that the spread of those animal diseases, because animals will be able to go outside more, disease transmission will be less. We should hopefully see some positivity in the livestock and meat sector as well. But that's yet to be seen, as of course it was still early in the spring somewhat in Europe at the moment.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Alan. And certainly seems like we're ending on a positive note, which is often a bit of a change from the normal, wouldn't you say? So yeah, once again, thank you very much, Alan, for your insights, and thank you everyone at home or in the office or wherever you're watching for tuning in.